So we've covered off now on 5 of the 7 steps to maximize value, okay? And what I want to do now is finish up with the last 2, which is borrow properly and plan for transition. And I think we'll combine them together because there's no calculating to do here. Just want to lay out and really summarize a lot of the things that we've already done, okay? Our learning objectives here are going to be really 5 of them. Number 1, putting yourself in the banker's shoes, okay? Because we want to talk now about pulling this all together into a loan proposal, or I guess we could also call it what? A business plan, huh? Understanding what banks look for in a borrowing relationship. We want to talk a little bit about that, although I think throughout the entirety of this course we've really been talking about that in a way, is narrowing down that communication gap between one side of the desk and the other. What it takes to be prepared, and again, I think we've covered off on a whole lot of that already in terms of the way we put this program together, how to communicate effectively, and finally, the other thing I want to do is talk about in the section on transition planning. This is not a course in transition planning, and therefore, actually, if you don't do the first 6 properly, you don't need the transition planning anyway, because there won't be a business to transition. But what we've done is we've put together a series of resources, and I just want to refer to them a little bit, and then take a trip through all 7 steps in terms of how they fit together. So let's talk a little bit about dealing with banks and bankers. I think what we've talked about so far, if we put everything together, sections 1 through 5 together, what do we really have? We really have a plan, and we get down to the very end, don't we, in financial gap, to that place where we either there's a plug or it's either red or green. Isn't that right? And if it's red, what do you know? You need to borrow. Maybe. But you probably need to borrow, which means we're going to have to take and put all these together. Now, one of the things I can say is, if we go through that process and we need to borrow, it looks like we need to borrow, maybe what we need to do is go back and see if we can't take a look at some of those sections and manage the business more what? Efficiently. And we'll talk about that a little bit when I kind of pull everything together, okay? So, question for all of you. We've dealt with banks, many of us, more than once, and will undoubtedly deal with banks in the future. We need the banking industry, and the banking industry needs us. Let's just develop a quick checklist of what would you be looking for? If you could write your ideal description of a banker, what characteristics would you be looking for? What qualities would you be looking for in a banker? Let's just name a few. Patience.
Knowledgeable.
Knowledge.
Responsive.
Responsive. What? Giving. Don't sugarcoat it. What else?
Consistency.
Consistency. In other words, you can count on a particular track, a particular way of behaving. How about candor? Yeah? Integrity? Yeah? All those things we assume. We could probably come up with a list. I've come up with a list with as many as 20 characteristics. Now, since I also have the opportunity to go and present and talk and meet with the banking industry, I've taken the same liberty of asking groups of bankers what they're looking for in a customer. And what do you suppose, probably not too ironically, occurs? How does the list look? Similar. It's not only similar, it's a literal carbon overlay. It looks exactly the same. So why is it we seem to have so much trouble sometimes getting together? Do we need a dating service? Or what? What is it between the lending community and the borrowing community? We've talked about it now throughout this course. What's missing potentially? Communication, speaking the same language, understanding what we're all looking for, and then how can we write it down, measure it, and be accountable for it. And that's really what we're looking for. We've come up in banking, there's what they call, what I've called at least, the 5 C's of credit. And this is something that has been around for a long time. Let's just talk about them. And then you can evaluate yourself on that basis as well. 1C, character, meaning what? Are you reliable? I saw a saying once that says, character is what you do when nobody's watching. You know? If nobody's going to be able to measure it, that's what doing the right thing when nobody's watching. That's what we're looking for. That's what banks are looking for. I believe the business community is very much straight shooters. There are the random, what would you call it, problems that we read about, but the fact is, I think most everyone in the business community, people who are trying to run businesses successfully, are pretty straight shooters, and they're pretty hard workers. And what they're looking for is somebody who will come back to them the same way. Capital, second C. What's that about? It would be good to have what? Be willing to what? Put it up. If you want me, to put money up, I would like to see you have what? Money up as well. If you're willing to put some money up, so I know that you're on the line as well, then I think we've got a workable scenario. Collateral. We've already talked about it not being a primary source of repayment, but for a lender, it's your what? It's your safety net, isn't it? It's your lifeline. It's your lifeline. It's a secondary source of repayment. If you're not willing to put it up, if you're not willing, in effect, to bet on yourself, why should a lender bet on you? Huh? I think that's really one of the things the business community needs to come to grips with is, if we don't have if you have all the capital you need, then you don't have to borrow, and none of this is an issue, is it? But if you don't have the money you need, you're missing a big chunk of what's going to be required, as we've seen in looking at this, at the components of profit mastery. Capital is pretty important. If you don't have it, then what do you have? Commitment. Commitment is really what you have, and how do you demonstrate that? By putting something on the line. Capacity. What is the capacity of the business scenario? Collateral. We've already talked about it not being a primary source of repayment. Debt and don't repay, that has some fairly components of profit mastery. Capital is pretty important. If you don't have it, then what do you have? Commitment. Commitment is really what you have, and how do you demonstrate that? By putting something on the line. Capacity. What is the capacity of the business to do what? Absorb debt and repay. Absorb debt and repay. If we absorb debt and don't repay, that has some fairly negative consequences built in, doesn't it? That's what we want to see, is we want to see how much do you need, what are you going to do with it, when are you going to pay it back, and how are you going to pay it back? If you can answer those questions, would you agree that you can probably borrow money? I would think that that's a pretty reliable approach. And finally, conditions that impact this whole process as well. What do I mean, conditions? Conditions not necessarily just in the business. Conditions where?
Economic climate.
In the economy. Conditions in the industry. Conditions in the regulatory marketplace. Conditions in the bank itself. Banks are businesses like all of us. They go through ups and downs as well. And if I walk in at the wrong time, I may not get a great reception. I want to finance a particular type of business. The bank has just closed down 3 of those. What are you guessing? Not a great time to, you've shown up at the wrong, could you possibly know that? No, but you can ask. But you can ask. Essentially, it's the do unto others as you would have them do unto you kind of thing, kind of a quid pro quo. We've said we're all looking for the same qualities, and what I think is in the middle, that is the missing ingredient, is the ability to communicate, and the language is numbers, isn't it? And that's what we've tried to put together here. That's what we've tried to put together. Now, there is one other thing that I'd like to talk about here in terms of how to put it together right, and we've talked throughout the entire program about short and long-term debt, haven't we? And I've created a little diagram, and what I'd like you to do is take a look at it. I call it the snake on the ramp for obvious visual reasons, huh? It's a benign snake, okay? But we've broken it into 3 parts, okay? That's what I'd like to take a look at. What type of asset are we acquiring? How are we going to finance it? And how's it going to get paid off? And if we can get those, you know, football teams, have you ever seen when they're in the huddle and the quarterback is calling a play and they look down and they've got this little thing on their, strapped on their wrist? What is it? It's the playbook. It's a micro version of the playbook. If we could have this diagram sort of stamped on everybody's hand, if everybody would put that down in the middle of the table, when we sat down with a lender and a borrower, and everything else that got put together, if we then checked it against this little graph, we would probably end up better off, in my opinion, because we'd be matching, and that's what we're really trying to do, isn't it? Match what? What are we trying to match? The life of the asset with the life of the loan. Isn't that right? If it's a short-term asset, we're going to use what? Short-term money. If it's a long-term asset, we're going to use long-term money. And that's what I've created here in this picture. I created 3 asset categories, didn't I? At the bottom, the foundation, fixed assets. These are the things, what are these? B&M. Bricks and mortar, huh? Bricks and mortar. And how are we going to finance them? Equity. See, you can't beat equity. If you've got equity, we don't have to have any more discussion. You can do what you want. But that's one of the beauties of capitalism. It allows us to create something of significant value, starting with what? Practically nothing. An amazing system that we stumbled on a couple hundred years ago, which has given us a leg up in terms of the world economy. It's a really amazing process that we've been talking through here. It truly is. Equity is what it's all about. Most of us are trying to create capital. We don't already have it, right? But if you do have it, wonderful. But if you don't, and we're buying fixed assets, let's use what kind of debt? Are you reading across with me? Long-term debt. And if it's long-term debt, we're going to pay it back out of what? Profits over a period of time. We don't get a 3-month mortgage, do we? We get a 30-year mortgage or a 20-year mortgage. So we pay it off over time. The next group of assets, permanent current assets. An interesting concept when we talk about current assets. This is those increases in what? Inventory and receivables. In a seasonal business, they go up, and then if the season comes back down, you remember, we bought them, then we sold them and didn't replace them, and that's how we got our money back. But if the business is growing long term, we'll continue turning them, but we won't go all the way back down to where we was, will we? So we've got our inventory and receivables grow. Well, from one year to the next, that wedge of what's growing, we can't pay that out of cash flow because we'd have to sell it, and we need it to continue to grow. We're going to end up financing that as well. Equity, if we have it, always Equity. Secondly, if it's a permanent current asset, let's use what? A permanent current. And what do we mean by that? You're my supplier. You want me to market your product? Grow with me. Give me more what? Let's talk our suppliers. They want us to sell their product. Then let's let them help us by growing our line of credit. And that will stay there as well, won't it? And if there's still anything left over, a kind of debt that's somewhere between long-term and short-term, which is what? Intermediate term. Intermediate term, meaning what? 3, 5, 7 years maybe, 3 to 5 usually, and it works. And then fluctuating current assets. And what do I mean by that? I mean that seasonal business, right? That goes up and down. We buy the assets, and then what do? Sell them. Isn't that right? And if we're going to buy them and sell them, that part of it that represents the season, we're going to finance that. If the season is a year, we're going to finance it with what? Short-term debt, which is less than a year, and we're going to repay it out of what? Cash flow. So long-term debt repaid out of cash flow. Intermediate-term debt, more than 3 to 5 years, still paid out, long-term debt paid out of what? Profit. Intermediate-term debt, more than a year, paid out of what? Profit. Less than a year, short-term debt paid out of what? Can you imagine a business that is it's a growing business, it's in a seasonal marketplace, and it requires fixed assets? Is it conceivable that in their package of borrowing they could have 3 different kinds of debt on the same balance sheet? Each one structured to do what? Meet the needs of the particular assets. We've matched the kind of asset with the kind of debt. And if we go through and do that, we almost always won't go wrong. We almost always get it right. So that's why I say this is one of those things that should act as a final checklist or a final check to make sure we've got what kind of debt are we acquiring, what kind of assets are being acquired, and how do we get this right? And the fact is, it's not necessarily our bank or our lender's responsibility. Certainly, they work to get it right. But whose responsibility is it to make sure it's right? It's the borrower. It's whoever's putting their X on the bottom line, because then you just took over the response. By signing it, you do what? You accept the responsibility. Make sure it's right. This is one of those where counting on yourself is a good way to go, using the tools that are there. And remember, in the end, if you can't pay it back, we ought not be borrowing it, huh? We've got to be able to show a way to pay it back. And I guess the last thing I want to be, well, from the standpoint of the bank, just double check yourself against this. And if you happen to be a lender, double check how you're doing this as well, so that everybody can work to get it right. And if we do all 6 of these components really well for a long time, what can we then do? Well, you can die. That's correct. There's a there's a better way to probably get out than that. But we've got to be able to exit out of the business, isn't that right? But keep the business going. What percentage of businesses make it to a second generation? About 8 to 9. What percentage of businesses make it to a third generation? Less than 1. Something happens along the way, doesn't it? Gets sold, nobody takes it over, the industry they were in goes away, and the business is no longer viable. It doesn't adapt itself to some new kind of venture. That's a pretty small part, isn't it? But there are some things that can be done, and we spend a lot of time looking at the process of transitioning. When do you start planning to leave the business, typically?
As you're starting.
The day you start it. in terms of managing it efficiently to produce what? More earnings and cash flow, so it has more value. There's 2 or 3 things as we talk about exit strategies that I'd like to just make you aware of. And again, we didn't plan on this being a program focusing significantly on transition, but what we did do, since it's certainly one of the pieces, the 7th piece, is we said, let's identify what are the components, and we created some resource material in that chapter, focusing really on 4 things: successor management, estate planning, who's going to take it over, and what's the value of the business. That's something that everybody wants to know something about, isn't it? What's my business worth? There are probably well over a dozen ways to value the business, and when we talk about valuation, we've included in our resource material how to value the business. Everyone tends to think their business is worth what? More or less? More than it is. Oftentimes more than it is. Typically, it's worth what it will generate in what? Cash flow. Some way of valuing it. If it won't generate cash flow, it doesn't have that much value, does it? Valuation, pretty important. One way to become an instant millionaire is what? Buy $1 million of insurance. But you got to die to get it is the problem. It's a little bit of a high price. Point being, the way we value the business is going to be, we got to ask 2 questions about value. What are they? And I alluded to it in an earlier section. To whom? For what purpose, right? You're being audited by the IRS. It's not worth that much. You're selling it. It's worth a lot. You're getting divorced. It's worth nothing. You see what I'm saying? To whom? For what purpose? And will it fly? Most of the time, we're not going to get cash. We're going to do what? Carry some sort of a contract, aren't we? And when we sell it to someone on a contract, what do we want it? What would we like to know for sure? That we're not going to get it back. It won't look that good when it comes back, so when we sell it, we want it to stay sold. Pick a good successor. Train them. We've put a whole checklist of issues in the resource material. And what I'd like to do as we finish up is I'd like to take a trip through all 7 of these steps. And I've created a little roadmap, and if you'll have a look at it and travel through with me, we'll just kind of see how they fit together. Plan properly, both at the beginning and when. All the way through the business. But under planning, I also want to add something. Use good advisors. Have a good accountant. Have a good attorney. Have a good insurance person. There's a whole good benefits person. There's a whole raft of professional advisors who can help you with that planning. And then do what? Use them. Use them. Their knowledge is no good if we don't tap into it and use them. Number 2, we talked about what? Monitor financial position. This was ratios, wasn't it? Our tool was ratios, and the time frame was what? The past. I said this gives us an indication of where we are. Then I said, okay, now let's look a little bit more and developing a plan of where we want to go. Then sections 3, 4, and 5 were about what? Getting there. Section 3, understanding the income statement. Variable cost, fixed cost, target profit. Target profit. Okay? If we know the variable cost, we know the fixed cost, and we know the profit. What can we calculate? the needed sales. Isn't that right? We can calculate the needed sales. What sales are we going to need to meet this? Then what do we need? We need two things. One is not a part of this course. We need a marketing plan that answers what question? How are we going to get there? And secondly, we need a cash flow, a cash budget that answers what question? Can we stay in business while we're getting there? In the short term, for a year. Then we said, based on that needed sales number, will we have enough money short term, section 4, manage cash flow, and long term, section 5, manage growth? That relationship between what? The sales on the income statement and the assets on the balance sheet. That relationship. We buy the assets to support the sales. Then we pay for them. That was section 5, managing growth. Section 6, if we come up with a financial gap, what do we know? We need a bank. So we put all of this into a plan. And then in section 7, if we've done this for a really long time, we now have a further plan to do what? Turn it over to somebody else who hopefully will continue its growth. Interestingly, in this country, we have a high failure rate of businesses, 80%, and secondly, we have a very low transition rate. So even those who are able to get them started, somehow don't seem to have the continuity. If we can change the failure rate by a little and the what? The succession rate by a little, we could have a huge impact in the economy. All of these tools, if I put them all together, what have I got? I got a plan. What's the difference between a business plan and a loan proposal? The cover sheet. Is that right? The cover sheet is the difference. A business plan is for you. A loan proposal is for someone else to look at. But if you lay it out exactly this way, with all the forms that we've got available in the course materials, I guarantee one thing. What kind of a response will you get from potential lenders? A much better response, because oftentimes what do they see in terms of a plan?
Words, no numbers.
No numbers, an idea written down. It just somehow, it isn't all put together. It's like it hasn't been thought through. And if you haven't thought through it, why would you expect anyone to bet on it? Huh? These are all the pieces of our course. What's the challenge now? To go back and apply it in your own business. We've had thousands of business owners attend and advisors attend this program, and we get continuous feedback that all these tools, interestingly enough, work. They do work. The process works. So the Profit Mastery Program gives you the tools and a process to take active control of your business. So like they say at the shoe company, just do it. Thank you very much, and good luck. Thank you. Thank you.